Russell Downs,
Hello,
welcome to the
morning.
DCQ Podcast Special Sits. Really happy that you're on, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have today. I understand you already started the day well by having a gym session. For me,
Yeah,
that's the best way of starting the
following
day.
your lead.
Is that something that you do regularly, or was this a one-off?
I've actually been to the gym 4 times this week, which is the sort of the dream becoming reality, I think. So yeah, no, that's good. Yeah,
Well,
it's good to go to the gym, but it's something that falls by the way for any number of reasons.
I agree. And I think we may get to that later on in the conversation, because it's my experience that, especially when you're a little bit earlier in your career, that's the first thing that you actually don't do is go to the gym. Because, hey, you're young and, why would you go to the gym? That's sort of the first thing that goes. I
Yeah,
think when you're in your career a little bit longer, you notice that actually that is very important to do, and you need to make it a priority.
yeah.
So today, we're both in London. This is sort of, a home game for us, but I expect that the conversation will not be limited to London or to the UK, and along the way we'll cross borders. And maybe, the best way to start is at the beginning. And I was wondering, so how did you actually end up in special situations, the distressed space that we're in? Was that by default? Was that by design? Was it a combination of the two?
I think it was just sort of the way the ride took the ride took me. I started my insolvency career as it was in the early 90s, and in that stage insolvency was really at the behest of the banks enforcing their debentures. As finance structures got more sophisticated and companies grew, so did actually the way you had to deal with an insolvency situation. And I think as I in myself developed, so I sort of found myself able to find solutions in those ever increasing situations. So as I sort of developed through the firm, yeah, I did sort of ever bigger, larger, more complex situations, and that's something I've done for sort of too long to confess at this early stage, but for many years.
Yeah, but when you're in school, did you know anything about insolvency? Had you ever been introduced to any situation that deals with financial distress, or was that not something you didn't go to university and thought, okay, I'm going to aim to be in this profession?
No, I had a very privileged upbringing, so my dad ran a kitchen manufacturing business, so there was always a sort of wind of challenge with that. On his bookshelf, he had a book by John Argenti called "Predicting Company Failure." So, as a at the time curious teenager, I did look at that. So it was something, that was the foundation of my first experience of sort of it doesn't necessarily work out all the time. I did a business studies course, and I did a sort of piece of work on that book, and actually, it's pretty relevant. That foundation has certainly stayed with me. So, but that was the origin. I ended up working for Coops and Lybrand Court Gullies. It was in the early 90s, because as a graduate without a job, actually you couldn't be too choosy, and actually the firms recruiting were insolvency people. So they picked me, and I was grateful on the basis that I didn't have any other options, so I picked them.
And was it competitive to get a job when you graduated from university?
And I think as it is now, it's a much more challenging process now. And I'd like to be young again, but not young again going through 100 round quest trying to get a job. But yeah, it certainly was competitive.
Yeah. So at home, there was already a little bit of an entrepreneurial environment.
Yeah.
So the life cycle of businesses was something that, you were at least aware of. And then you did business studies and actually got an interest in, I guess, the phase of the life of a company where it's a little bit more challenging. So you started with Coopers and Lybrand. Well, they became PwC, one of the big four accountancy firms. I mean, was there like an intake in your year of, how many people started and how many people actually ran the course?
Um, I mean, uh, I think, for the big firms, they're recruiting, hundreds. I think PwC at its peak was probably taking over 1,000 graduates. And it's definitely a pyramid in terms of you lose a few in the early years and then you lose a lot for good reasons in that they move into banking or other sort of areas after they qualify. And so yeah, it does narrow down in the later years, but I think any firm is recruiting way more than it's ultimately promoting through to partner, which actually I think it makes it pretty challenging for the youngsters now thinking about their own careers, really.
And are you earmarked immediately as, okay, you're going to do insolvency and you're going to do something else? Or is it like you have your rotating seats? The way I, came into law was very much in the largest law firm in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
You had an intake of people, and actually, I ended up in bankruptcy because the partner that was looking after me, he was an insolvency focused partner, one of the few in the Netherlands that did actually, do national and later on international insolvencies. And that's just luck of the draw. And sort of that's how it, developed for me. You have an intake in your year of what is it, maybe not hundreds, but like 30, 40 maybe people that start. And then, yeah, if you look later on, you see maybe one or two make it to partner.
Um,
Is that
yeah,
sort of also your experience in PwC?
yeah, I think that it's a long journey. I think when I started, it would be a 10-year term from joining to the prospect of partnership. I think that's now considerably longer, and actually, it's not for everyone. So I think people will definitely be more thoughtful around where their career takes them, and thinking I've done that, I'm going to go do something different. But certainly for me, I joined the insolvency world sort of, I think, a couple of weeks after Polypec went bankrupt, which was the start of that big sort of early 90s large casualty. So I didn't plan to do that. I literally ended up going into a small team at Coopers that did corporate insolvency, and as opposed to business reviews or debt advisory or forensics as it's now become. It's just the way it worked out.
So early on for you, it was, I want to become or should become an IP, an insolvency practitioner. And then I want to take appointments. And in the UK, you take appointments as liquidator, you can take it as an administrator, special administrator, you've been a special manager, you've
Uh,
been a receiver,
yeah.
all of that. Early on in your career, sort of how are you acquiring your skills to then, become what you are today?
Mm. I think the honest answer is I failed a lot. So and there've been a few moments when actually you've got to have a pretty serious think about what it is you want to do. So for me, my personal style is I always wanted to sort of try and have as much control over what I was doing as possible. And so inevitably it's around pushing and developing. And, I've had that from my sort of, my growing up, my sort of personal background and all those sorts of things. So as a youngster coming into the business, you're looking up to see, what are the role models, where do you want to get to? And sure, it's competitive. And, for that world, it was, you know, getting to the partnership level was a pretty big, target and challenge, but it wasn't easy. And as I say, I failed a lot along the way. I knew I had to do some exams, but it took me a number of goes to get through that. I knew I had to do my insolvency exams again, because actually, if you want to do insolvency work, you probably want to take appointments as well. So it's a hard graft. It was then, and I'm probably equally sure it is now for sure.
So it's interesting. You mentioned a couple of things. One is some role models. And I think these days it's all about mentors, right? Who are your mentors or role models that sort of help you get to where you want to become? How easy is it to identify these people? And how do you actually strike a relationship with them, or was it not a relationship, as such, but maybe from a distance you're watching how they do things and you copy?
Yeah, I think it's, you're in your day job, but it's actually having that awareness to look around. And a role model can be something that you're drawn towards, not as by way of cloning, but by way of actually you see an attribute, you see a style that you like. And if you work closely with people over time, there's a way to sort of emulate some of that. But equally, it was, I worked for some pretty tough people in my, not talking about clients, but some pretty tough people, managers and indeed partners as well. And actually, that was pretty challenging. But you can see the force for good in some of that. It might manifest itself in terms of challenging, in terms of how you get through your day. But actually, again, you're ultimately looking at the skills and attributes, and trying to make a conscious decision about those that you feel can help you, and those you feel you want to stay, a long way away from. So it's sort of, actually, you're going to interact with any number of people, and there's infinite ways to sort of capture and take those experiences for your own development.
So you're also saying that you failed a number of times in order to actually improve and achieve the goals that you have eventually achieved. We're in a space where the stigma is still very negative about insolvency, restructuring, turnaround, special situations, to say it, a little bit more pretty, but it's the same thing. For you, well, being in that space, why do you think it is still so negative? And based on your experiences, isn't failure, and even, well, maybe we shouldn't call it failure because it's just an essential part of succeeding. It's the next step to success. You need to fall down a couple of times and stand up and move forward. Why is it still so negative and stigmatized?
I, I I'm not sure. I don't know. I think that inevitably, we're in a world where success is always pretty important. So, I think, yeah, whether you're losing a football game, or whether you've lost an investment or a business, or you have to let people go, or you look at your product line and actually some of them don't cut it anymore. You've got to take tough decisions. I just think that's all part of, actually, it's not something that people readily jump to do. I think, when the sun's out, we're all, well, most of us, if not all of us, are sort of that much, better, aren't we? So I don't know, but you know, it creates opportunity. And I think that those that can, there are those that capitalize on it, whether they're professionals, investors, or whatever. It provides opportunity, and that's great.
But is it because we in the profession are ill equipped to actually explain to the people outside of our bubble, the outsiders, what we do and how we do it? And is it maybe the reporting is a little bit one sided because it's always about the big fraudsters that do things? And therefore, that is what people believe has everything to do with insolvency. There are many causes of insolvency,
Yeah,
and you've alluded to it already.
yeah,
It's a life cycle of a business.
mm,
Like a person gets ill and you can be cured, right?
mm,
So maybe a couple of things. One is, how would you describe what you're doing to, well, your kids, for example, or people that are outside the bubble? What
mm.
is it that we do?
Um, I think the key thing that we provide is leadership, and clarity in challenging times, and that is, you know moving quickly to get involved in something, trying to get to grips with the personalities, the stakeholders, the issues within the business, um, and actually trying to find a solution that is better than the alternative. Um, and fundamentally, it's not, at our sort of stage, it's not jumping straight into the detail and you know committing a couple of 100 hours and saying there's a solution. It's much more dynamic and subtle than that. It's working with people, as I say, to calm things down, buy some time, identify what the issues are, and build consensus when actually probably you're in a world where relationships are challenged, if not broken, and that's all that much harder. And I think as well as being good to succeed in your own qualification, lawyer, accountant, whatever, actually, I think the strong performers in our world, they've got that ability to provide leadership, provide the way to bring stakeholders together for a joint mutual outcome. And that's not easy, and it's not something that everyone can do. But that's where, that's ultimately within special situations, what's going to make a difference would be my view.
And so if you had to sort of describe the attributes that a person needs to have to be in this space, what would be the attributes that are the most important? You alluded to the fact you need to have some technical skills, but that's almost like a given. It's more than that. There are other things that are important, specifically in the environment that we operate in. Characteristics, for an
Yeah.
individual. Do you need to have like an entrepreneurial spirit? Do you need to be a salesperson? Do you need to be a manager, attention for detail? Do you need to be a technician, knowing your stuff inside out? Or is there like something else that you need to have in order to have longevity in this space?
I would put it down to, you've got to listen and watch. If you're doing that well, you're picking up the signs, and from that you're building your own hypothesis of what you think's needed. Inevitably, you know, special situations, larger situations, you're going to be working with a really talented team, not necessarily all on the same side, but actually, if you're listening and watching, you're working within that group to get to the bottom of things and find a way forward. And I've certainly never held myself out as sort of the originator of all good ideas. The important thing is to work with teams and find ways for someone around that table to feel able to share what they think's any idea. Many of them will get dismissed, but actually any number of times, I'm sure you as well have been surprised that the best idea has come from someone unexpected. And I think that comes back to the role that you take as increasingly sort of more mature person in the world, that actually you've got to help people come through, and you've got to help people able to contribute to that result. And isn't that good to be able to do that?
Yeah. So if you look back um, at the time that you've been in practice, what has changed since you started? Is it the case that we're better equipped these days to rescue companies, while in the past it was a lot more cleaning up, liquidating, enforcing? Or, was it in the past actually also rescue, but in a different way?
Mm. Oh, that's you could write a book on that. But I think the bits that strike me is most things will have a cross-border dimension to them. So you're working cross-culture, and that can be challenging. The laws are going to be different. People's attitudes are going to be different. Behaviors different. All that sort of stuff. The corporate framework is far more sophisticated now than it has been, and that brings complexity.
The corporate frame, you mean it's not just one company with a board, but there are various layers. There's a more complex capital structure. There's not just one bank loan, but there are various instruments.
If you
There's a
printed off
group.
all
It's
the
one
finance,
one.
if you printed off all the finance documents, you'd need a pretty big desk to carry it all. So we're these businesses are much more sort of structured and beholden to their leading stakeholders. I think on stakeholders, actually, you've got to give consideration to a much greater range of stakeholders. I think within the UK at the moment, the UK government is pretty much in all large situations going to be a really important stakeholder, as we're seeing. And I think the other thing or two more things that change. One is access to capital, and so that drives opportunity and solutions, and that has fundamentally changed how insolvency has been delivered over my time, starting when the Insolvency Act 1986 was just being bedded down, through to the Enterprise Act of early 2000s, through to the COVID insolvency regime of save the company at all costs, and that is pretty fundamental. So actually, I think that's all good. Corporate insolvency, can't emphasize it enough. It is a catastrophic event on a company. So it does it does require everyone to work really hard to protect value by avoiding insolvency, and that's not easy given large situations, complexity, and all of that. But that's the motivator, and with capital out there, always looking for opportunities, that's the challenge for us in our market.
So the players, the government taking a more prominent role in situations. Interestingly enough, I think Thames Water is sort of a case in point. There, the Court of Appeal was very clear on the public interest should be represented by the regulator and the pensions regulator as well. And they were the least active in the situation. So I think it is true that the government needs to be more active. Access to capital. So traditionally, especially in Europe, it was in Europe and UK, it was the banks that were dominating the insolvencies. But that has changed with, I guess, the arrival of distressed investors alongside the banks, and I guess private capital alongside traditional banking. Have how was it when the banks were dominating things, and how has it become since I guess the distressed investors have arrived? What were the big changes that you saw in your practice?
I mean, it went from a small village to a global world. You went from four banks one of which you pretty much guarantee would be involved in a situation through to, any number of financial institutions or private offices owning debt in a business. So, it's fundamental change. I mean, I remember, the 90s restructurings when, you were just getting into a world of banks being able to sell out their participation, their position in a lending, but there was a restriction that they had to sell to another bank. That's long since gone, and I think it's really important, but there is obviously a really clear role for secondary investors to play to provide access to banks to move out more quickly, where so that's changed. But for the restructuring world, it's much harder because you don't know who the key movers will be, and they can change day to day. So it's a much more challenging environment.
And they also, if you can buy into a situation on the secondary market, you can do it at a discount. So the economics change dramatically too, which has an influence on the possible solutions and whether or not something is successful or
Yeah.
not. Because if you're a par holder, you may just want to minimize the loss that you have in recovery of your principal. But if you've bought in at a huge discount, then actually you could look at a profit if things go well. That is a completely different dynamic, I think, one. And two is the banks traditionally didn't want to own a company, right? They're not in the business of actually getting equity. So if you want to exchange your debt for equity, then that's not really what the banks wanted to do. But those funds, distressed investors, that's exactly what they wanted to do. So in that respect, I guess it increased the options for, finding solutions. The toolkit actually, became bigger.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think early 2000s you had a number of debt for equities, and the banks didn't like them because absolutely they found it hard to value, hard to hold the equity, whereas the secondary investors or the bondholders, they were much more prepared to take a bigger discount, probably because they'd already bought in at a discount, and see the value come back through equity. So yeah, no, it's
And
very different.
the influence of the US on the UK, that is partly the distressed investors that came across the Atlantic and also landed in London. But the system in the US is quite different from that in the UK. They're both rescue systems, or at least systems focused on rescue. But in the US, it's all court driven, and the person actually ultimately leading it is the judge, while in the UK it is very much the IP who is an officer of the court. What's sort of your views on that big difference, and how have you sort of dealt with that in your practice?
Yeah, they are very different, and I think everyone prefers to have one favorite, which is probably the one you know best. I think actually in the current world, both of them are, in special situations, are very, very expensive processes that obviously come out as a priority cost for the debtor. So that that comes back to the complexity, the scale of what's needed, and the fact that they run for some time. So yeah, the US system has much more involvement of the court, and I know from sitting in US courtrooms, the judge is very hands-on and unchecked in terms of working off a script that English counsel would find it challenging, frankly, to see how the judge can sort of advocate for their own ideas, all with a view actually to try and find a solution. So So it's personally, I've seen that being very valuable actually at times as well. So I think,
The active
yeah,
judge, you
yeah,
mean?
yeah, absolutely. I think that there's probably a similarity around process in terms of, they both take, what is it, say 9 months to deliver a restructuring. Sure, in the UK, you might not see an insolvency person come in till relatively late, potentially as part of that person, but I'd be pretty sure that there will be a whole load of advisors working to get to that point. In the US, court involvement comes much earlier on to kick that process off, provide various sort of safeguards along the way. Whereas here, I think in the UK, you can manage that without, the early court intervention. But as you mentioned, Thames Water, I think the courts have said, they don't want to be involved when it's, late and under pressure. If they can be involved earlier, that I think is pretty important. So I think there is something to think about there.
One thing that struck me when I, arrived in the UK from the Netherlands, where, appointments were taken by lawyers, where we didn't have barristers, where the process is just different, is if you have an IP here and you start a situation, then you would come in as an advisor to the company, help out strategizing what needs to happen, but then you're also, in pole position to almost change color once there's a filing and you become an officer of the court. And especially in, I guess, pre-pack administration sales, again, the public has maybe a misconception about the benefit that a sale like that usually has, because they're focused on the fact that the unsecured creditors are barely aware of it, and all of a sudden a deal is executed moments after the filing takes place, and sometimes that is back to the owners of the company in the first place. So what's your experience with that, and how could you, because in my experience, especially with working with IPs, is that they take that extremely seriously because their professional reputation is on the line. But that is something that is very hard to understand by the man or woman in the street.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Pre-packs. I mean, I've been involved actually as a director going through a pre-pack process, but also as a office holder, sort of, finalizing the transaction. So um, I think that they play a very valuable part, and I say that because it minimizes the adverse impact on the business through a trading insolvency. Insolvency is a catastrophic event on a business, so it is not set up for long-term management at the control of an insolvency practitioner, however skilled. It's expensive, contracts terminate, it's got risk which inevitably will manifest itself around value erosion. So pre-pack is a means to eliminate that risk and ensure that actually you can move in an orchestrated, effective way from, a broken shell to a new corporate in environment. So I'm definitely supportive of that. I also agree with the sentiment that actually I think the restructuring profession has got really high integrity to actually save businesses, and I know that that's been a pretty big feature of my career, to think about jobs saved and think about rescues and all of that. It's not, it's an easy path to take to say, well, a firm will benefit through a fat rate insolvency fee. So I don't buy that at all. We have to recognize though that there are examples where a pre-pack hasn't met the objective 100%, and it's left a bad taste, bad smell for stakeholders who, frankly, haven't enjoyed the experience and think that actually nothing's changed from their perspective. So I think that's unfortunate. It's probably unavoidable. I would hope that actually it's a marginal end of the value that comes of doing a good pre-pack, job saved, etc., etc., etc. But I think that my final piece on that is I think that an insolvency person is held in high office, high qualifications, and high accountability. And actually, if you fail in that regard, I think you deserve a very big sanction. That has to be the stick that ensures that those people that have the privilege of being involved in a type of transaction, remain focused to deliver the benefits of that, rather than get sort of go down a wrong path of not delivering the benefits for stakeholders.
So is it the lack of transparency plus, I guess, the reputation of the IPs involved? So if there's enough transparency and there is trust in the qualifications and the professionalism of the IP involved, then that should take care of, as you say, the bad taste or the bad smell that surrounds it. Or are there other reasons why, there sometimes is a bad taste or a bad smell? Is it because people don't understand what has happened, or people don't appreciate that it could be a lot worse than what the pre-pack actually has achieved?
I think that, let's sort of focus it around larger situations, because, I think that's sort of, more perhaps more relevant. So I think there probably is a higher level of transparency, because there's probably already going to be an awareness of it within the media, or it's been an ongoing talked about situation. So the issue of transparency is hopefully one that can be mitigated through that. Clearly, if there's been a sales process and there's been some publicity around that as well, that will help transparency. I think the challenges around the impact on unsecured creditors. So whilst you're continuing to trade versus the moment when you switch to a sale transaction, and that within the UK environment, the directors have that discretion. They have clear guidelines by which sort of it's legitimate to continue to trade, but it's ultimately their subjective decision. They're accountable for that. It's a scrutinized event by the incoming insolvency person. But I think it's the transparency into that process that probably drives much of the sort of fact that unsecured creditors feel they've been left behind, dislocated in the process. And is that fair? What was the transparency in those sort of final stages? And actually have their exposures gone up? And I think that's the sort of the challenge around trying to protect value, move quickly, do the best for all stakeholders. That's an unenviable set of competing agendas to try and find the right outcome for. But as I say, hopefully with the right team working hard to deliver a solution, you can look back and say we've done the best we can in the circumstances there.
Understood. Look, I've held off a little bit, but want to maybe bring in a big feature in your career, which is something that happened on the 15th of September 2008. And it has affected, I guess, everybody in the business in many ways, my practice as well, but your practice enormously, I would think. And it's sort of, it is the case of cases. And I'm talking about Lehman, of course. You were one of the Lehman administrators, not on day one. And not until the end. I don't think there is any Lehman administrator that has done the whole course, because it's still ongoing. But I'd like to maybe unpack that situation a little bit from your perspective, because you were very much in the driver's seat on a big part of it, and maybe then relate back to maybe some of the other things that we've discussed already, and pick up on some other things that are important. I think looking back, a lot of people will today ask, well, how did that actually happen? And could it happen again? Was that a unique, perfect storm that sort of happened and it will never happen again? Yeah. What's your take on it? And how did you get involved? And how sort of, did you get your feet more than wet in this situation?
Um, yeah, so I mean, I think everyone working in 2008 in the restructuring special situations insolvency world will know what they were doing on that day. To me, it was of course an incredible day. I felt like I'd been left on the bench, candidly, because yeah, I wasn't sort of out onto the pitch straight away. I I started working on the Lehman matter probably a couple of years afterwards.
I saw that you were appointed in November, what was it, 2011. So
11.
yeah, a couple of years in. But I mean, you may not be, I guess, an administrator in capacity, but you probably were from day one involved.
No, not really. I did. I think I did a year before I sort of went onto the ticket, so to speak. So it was again, it talked at the outset about things that sort of don't necessarily go well for you. For me, I was doing corporate insolvency, and of course, I wanted to do Lehman, but I didn't. We were a big practice, and it was right that not the whole practice didn't go into that, and so actually, I covered a number of other things for that period of time. But actually, to go into Lehman then when I did, personally worked out really well because it was stable by many respects, but there was still an awful lot to do. So it was a bit of a tag team. Sort of some of my colleagues came out, and then a new set went in. But yeah, even starting 2010, I think I did over 10,000 hours on that. o-
Wow.
Over, well, mostly over the first number of years. So yeah.
And what were the aspects of that big situation? Well, I mean, maybe you have a view. What caused it? Because if you sort of read back, it very much seemed that everything was closing in and confidence was lost. And in a week's time, the value of the investment bank went down with, a staggering 80% or something like that. It's a little bit like the run on the bank that we saw in the UK with Northern Rock. You build something up for a long period of
Yeah.
time, but clearly you can almost lose it overnight.
Yeah.
Was that what happened?
Um, I mean, to me, everyone knows. I think most people know with hindsight that everyone's been paid off. So, big head scratch around why did it go bankrupt in the first place? It went bankrupt because it was long on assets but short on cash. So, where
A
paying,
liquidity crisis.
yeah,
They
yeah,
didn't
paying
have
your
the cash. They
obligation,
were rich,
yeah,
but
asset
not with something that you can
cash.
pay people with.
Yeah, and so that sort of London evening when I think the US business said they couldn't fund the Monday morning margin call meant that actually court protection was the only course available. I think you know I think my sort of Lehman colleagues all most of them felt that they'd be working for a different bank on the Monday morning. They certainly didn't think they'd be working for an administrator. But that's the way it played out. So my view, never see anything like that. That again. I just think that was, as you say, a perfect storm of where the world was at that time.
But can you use it as a case study to run a couple of things? For example, this is so huge, it's very cross border. Uh, the English system is quite different from the US system, from other systems that were involved. How do you assemble your team to go in? And how do you divvy up the work? And how do you identify what are the main issues to deal with on a case that is that large?
I think I think the consensus amongst the administrators was that it's staying focused around. It's still a corporate insolvency, yeah. It's trying to work, as I said before, watch and listen. It's understand what the issues are within the business, and then
So,
find.
so who knows that? The board should know that.
Yeah,
Those are the advisors of the company should
the board
already,
and
been involved for a while, and they need to download or where, or obviously seeing the books.
yeah,
But okay, this is massive.
yeah, yeah. My characterization of Lehman was that sure, it was a big company, well, a group of companies cross border. I don't know how many companies were in the UK, but there were a couple of really material companies. But it wasn't the company itself; it was actually what was in it. It was like a becalmed oil tanker. The issue was to, take control of that vessel, and actually the insolvency process. There was no rules around special administration at that time. The insolvency process had to be geared in order to offload all of the contents within that business. So, the custody of assets, and all of that. That was the complexity. Of course, there were a whole load of financial instruments that had to be closed out or had been closed out, and so there was a huge, verification exercise in order to work through that. But it was absolutely fascinating to be part of that for so long. But I think, net right at the bottom, you were still coming to work grounded around your insolvency experiences, about empowering teams, who were clearly really gifted in their world, and trying to find solutions that would bring about, the best outcome. So, we had a blank sheet of paper to find our way through it, and that was the fun and the challenge of what we did.
One of the things that I guess my sons sometimes ask me is, what is your job? Do you have a job, or is it, a career, a calling, whatever it is? And it's not necessarily the typical 9 to 5 job.
Mm.
There's a lot of urgency involved. It can be very big and all inclusive, which means that if you do it, you better actually enjoy doing it, because you're going to do an awful lot of it. Is that something that you've experienced as well? I assume the answer is yes, because you're still at it, but it is very important. So for you, how important is your profession in your life?
Mm. Um, yeah, no, yeah, my work's been, massively important to me. There are times where it's got in the way of any number of, things, personal events, or whatever, or going to the gym, or whatever it happens to be. But it's, I just think that if you didn't, fundamentally, if you're able to take enjoyment from your work, you're in a really fortunate place. And I was able to do that. And in doing that, part of the downside is that it isn't necessarily routine working schedule. So we know that, if company gets into trouble, it can be just when you sort of not necessarily expect it. So you just got to be ready.
But I know you're, a family man as well. So how do you sort of marry the two up? You've done it successfully. So what's the secret here?
Oh, I don't know that there's a secret. I think a very patient family is probably the answer. And I know it is really tricky managing those agendas. And sometimes I did all right with them. Other times, for a period of time, I think I was pretty poor. You gotta take the rough with the smooth, I think.
Yeah. And it's openness, explaining what it is and understanding on the other side.
Yeah, yeah, and apologizing. Yeah.
Apologizing. Uh, so we've touched upon it a little bit, but What would you say for your part of the business, and maybe also for my part of the business, the legal and the financial side in special situations? What is it when you can say, well, actually, I'm mastering my trade? What does that mean?
Um, I think the sort of I think it's like any sportsman, isn't it? If it looks like you've got time, yeah, and you're in control, you're probably doing well. So I think to me that manifests itself by actually not doing too much, having a great team around you to help, and as I say, being engaged in the process so that you're in control of it, and that's that's working with others to find the best solutions and all of that, and that's if you can do that, react quickly, then it looks like you've got time, and I think that's important. If you haven't got time, you're under pressure. We know we're in a world where the client expectations are very high. Things have got to happen quickly. So I think being able to portray that actually you've got time and the coverage to deal with things is what holds big teams together.
So you got time, but you need to create time because there are a million things that need to be done. Is insufficient, imperfect information, but decisions need to be made.
Mm,
So you need to be comfortable
mm,
to deal with uncertainty,
mm.
make decisions, and I guess convince people that those are decisions that need to be made. And
Yeah,
that is something that you learn by putting in the reps, by doing, many of these things, carefully looking at others, how they do it, these role models that you were mentioning before, and having the opportunity to have a go yourself
yeah.
and make these decisions and run the course.
I think it's chunking up your time in a way that is your own thinking time. So it's the bit that means that you've anticipated things that are going to be coming up, and that you've done your own thinking on things, yeah? So that you can put your own thoughts down into a debate about what it is. I think that's pretty important for credibility.
How do you create that time then? Because again, you'll be brought in, there are, from all ends are questions fired at you. You need to get your arms around the situation. How do you get, as you say, that peace of mind for yourself so that you are comfortable, that you've been able to think about it and on the basis of that make decisions, even though the information that you have is far from complete and not perfect at all?
I mean, everyone will be different. For me, it's either sort of really early in the morning or late at night, but it's sort of, it's late at night. It'll be sitting down with a pot of tea and a bar of chocolate and just, working through it. So, that's really important to be able to do that. As I say, if you're not doing that, I'm just not sure what you've got. For me, my leadership style is around empowering. So it's working with a team to be clear around what needs to be done, but actually not stifling everyone's ability to get on and make things happen. But you need to spend time with your team so that actually things are happening, and if you're doing that, that gives you leverage so you can cover more ground. And then the next aspect is constant doubt. It's have you done enough to think, what are you missing? If it's an adversarial position, what are the other side going to be up to? Because you don't want to be outsmarted. So it's an iterative process, but you have got to be working pretty hard to make sure that you've got your own thoughts, your team are working hard against their objectives, and they're doing well as individuals. But also, yeah, you've got to be thinking where the other pieces on the chessboard are going to be moved around.
Yeah. And what would you say is success for you in a special situation? I mean, you obviously have a certain role to play. Typically, you're coming in as IP, you're an officer of the court, but it may very well be that, in other situations you're an advisor. Could be on the creditor side, could be on the debtor side, could be on the shareholder side, could be for the government, could be for somebody that is outside of the situation but wants to acquire it. What defines success?
Success to me is signing an agreement that you never have to look at again, fundamentally. The best agreement you'll sign is one that never comes back to subsequent examination. That's fundamental. Thereafter, success is actually it's our world is transaction based, so it is the success of the transaction, and that will be job saved, the business saved, or a large part of it, debt refinance, impact on other stakeholders, and all of that. And that actually, that's been constant through, what's kept me in an insolvency world, which is actually, if you're faced with a group of stakeholders who've got a pretty unattractive initial outcome, you can work with them over a period of time and improve upon that so that they're getting, a way better outcome than they might have expected. Actually, I think you've got a clear purpose and you're doing good work. So that's what, success is. And I know, I've reflected on that a number of times, and thankfully, I've been sued a couple of times, so I have had to go back over contracts that I have signed, but that's been a minority of instances.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because it looks to me as, your position being the officer of the court, looking after all the interests. If you want to have an agreement, an alignment, there needs to be, I guess, a compromise, and a compromise where parties are all, well, make it acceptable means that everybody is actually unhappy. So you need to deal with, if everybody's unhappy, then probably you've done a good job.
Yeah.
If there is a couple of people that are happy and a couple of people that are not happy, there may be an imbalance, right?
Yeah.
And inevitably, in a situation like this, kill the messenger, right? So you are usually the messenger then, and they want to go after you or scrutinize you. How do you deal with that? Because you're going in harm's way, taking up the responsibility of sorting out the mess. But that has consequences.
Yeah. I think that the solution that's advocated on day one is rarely the solution that crosses the line, 6 months later. So I think that process of refinement is a way to, minimize the disruption. Think we'll see, imported from the States, much more challenged now, where parties will go to court if they're unhappy. The litigation model, funded or self-driven, is there. So I think that's just part of the checks along the way to make sure that actually you are including all stakeholders and giving them an opportunity to comment on the process. But you can never get that 100%. You can never rule out that someone will be sufficiently unhappy that they will take action. But it's sort of, you just got to do the best you can, haven't you, to sort of be clear around what you're doing, communicate that well, and again, it comes back to, if you've really done your own thinking around what the adversarial position is, you should be able to take a view, and that's obviously working with the legal teams of barristers. But if you've spent time in court, judges, clearly they're legally trained and very, very smart people, but I think they're ultimately making judgments, and actually that's what I think anyone in special situations should be able to do. It's that projection into actually what is an independent challenge, and what do you think about that? And through that groundswell of experience going to court and other transactions, you get I think, your own perspective of what's fair and unfair. And I'm certainly driven by that.
How do you not take it personally?
I think I'm pretty chilled by nature. I mean, some things I do. When I have been sued, it's hard. You've got to take that personally because it's pretty open criticism. But
And it's your reputation, which, as we all said, it takes a long time to build, and
yeah,
you can you
yeah,
lose it overnight. And
yeah,
again, does anybody actually takes the time to look at the details, or are they saying, is Russell again in
yeah,
court, right?
yeah,
But yeah, Russell is actually doing stuff.
yeah,
And if you do stuff, you're in harm's way. And if
yeah,
there are people having a go at you, that doesn't mean that you haven't done your
yeah,
job well. It means that you've been busy doing your job.
yeah.
But what about, your colleagues and the firm? How important is it that, well, they obviously have your back and that you get the support, especially if you don't want to take it personally. You do take it personally to a
Yeah.
certain extent.
Yeah, no, I think it's about working with a good team to ensure that you're in it together. So, um, but managing risk, liability, reputation is pretty important. So you've got to work through it, and the important thing is that I think one of the phrases, it's not my phrase, I've heard it from one of my former colleagues, that the worst decision is one made alone. And to me, that has a real resonance, that if you're working with a team along the way, of course I would ultimately be responsible for it, but actually if your team is engaged, then if there's a consensus amongst your team that what you think you're doing is right, that's a pretty good defense ultimately. So if you make decisions collectively, you'll be in a much stronger place than if you make a decision on your own.
But is there in the team room for others to chime in? It depends, I guess, on your leadership style and allowing people to express their views and the sort of atmosphere that you create.
Yeah.
And the other thing that sort of occurs to me is, so are you saying that in special sits,
Mm.
you really, in essence, are not a specialist? You're a generalist in a specialist situation.
I think I'm a facilitator, so I think to me it's a transaction focus. That's the fundamental here. Definitely be time pressure, definitely be financial constraint, but it's working through that. So yeah, I think you'll bring. There's a time I knew, you'll know about the industry you're in for a period of time, and you may carry that into your next one. But fundamentally, it's a situational experience that I think is what gets you home, and that's what makes a difference. And I think, just going back to your last point, that's, I think, one of the benefits of our sort of newer way of working. Actually, I think you are teams do come together more easily now. I would often say that the best way of working is with everyone sat around a table, jumping in and all of that. But I think with online working, actually, I think people the youngsters coming through have had more inclusion through the teams meetings and all of that, than being constrained to sort of limit how many you might take to a sort of physical meeting sometimes.
That's interesting. Yeah. So actually, you can be a fly on the wall easier than being dragged along in a meeting where it's too crowded
Yeah,
and there's a couple of more boxes open on the screen. It doesn't matter, but you can listen in.
exactly.
That's definitely so. Maybe going back to Lehman for a second, what would be a couple of the successes that you believe you've achieved in that situation? Obviously, a big one, and maybe you can explain what it was all about. Is the waterfall litigation, and the waterfall had a number of iterations, so it's not just one waterfall. There's a lot
Yeah.
going down the waterfall there. So that was one that you were very much involved in, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So Lehman, the key English Lehman entity was a regulated, very well capitalized business. So
So that was Lehman Brothers International Europe, LBAI, right?
LBIE,
The
no,
investment bank, yeah,
yeah. So yeah,
broker dealer.
it had capital, billions of pounds of capital. Second half of September through to the end of the year, it got hammered as it was the defaulting party. Counterparties closed out, determining their values. So lots of that capital got eroded. We then had a typical group insolvency situation when the English company, it was capitalized relative to its external obligations, external positions, owed and external positions that its receivables. Um, but there wasn't provision for a whole load of intercompany claims that came through as respective office holders all around the world had bar dates and all of that, and that drove a massive number of protective claims that all of the estates had to work through.
So bar dates, the dates by which the claims need to be submitted in the relevant insolvency in that jurisdiction.
So as a practitioner, if you miss that bar date, you're in a world of pain. So you're going to come up with a number and then double it for just to be sure that it's not understated. So for the English company, we found ourselves with what we thought would be a lot of assets, and we knew we had external claims, but the gating item was, think about, I forget the number, certainly 20, if not more, billion pounds of affiliated debt. So the outcome for that company would be around how much of that 20 billion was admitted. As we paid dividends, initially we had to reserve for the 20 billion, but as we worked through it, that number came down. So whilst the assets were stabilizing around a projected level, our claims were coming down at a much faster rate, which meant the dividend went up. Ultimately, the success of the English operation was that 20 billion got admitted for 1 billion. So that meant that actually the capital over and above what was owed to third party creditors was pretty much protected, subject to closeout costs and obviously, pretty expensive insolvency process. But that was the capital that was left.
So the 20 billion was the claims from other entities into the English entity
Yeah,
that was, reserved for 20 billion. In
yeah,
the end was only a billion.
yeah,
So there was a lot more in the English entity than
yeah.
initially thought.
Well, the claims were a lot less. So the assets were pretty much projected. So it meant that actually you didn't have a dilution to unexpected creditors. And that broadly replicated around the other significant entities around the world, because from the English administrator's point of view, we were doing the same. We were filing very big speculative claims elsewhere. And I think, in special situations, I don't know that, international working around bar dates is a good thing. I think that is ultimately an impediment to a successful cross-border insolvency. It's great for the secondary investors because it means that actually it dilutes the day one delivery dividend impact potentially that we saw spectacularly rise through the English company. So once we paid off the third-party creditors, we had capital left, and therefore the big debate through the waterfall series is, where does it go? Yeah. And everyone had a view, and we had to use, a series of English proceedings to, try and bring legal certainty to that, which ultimately did come. And then to wrap that up, we did a scheme in order to see that capital returned to the shareholders ultimately. But
Which is extraordinary, right? We're talking about a situation where monies are going back to the shareholders, which over and above 100% payout plus all interest that hasn't been paid is paid, and then still there's something left to go to shareholders, and including subordinated creditors. Everybody is paid.
Yeah. And so unsecured creditors at 100%, they then got 40% uplift for statutory interest over the period that the debts were owed. Then I think there was subordinated debt that got paid, interest on that got paid, and then I think they're paying preferred equity now. So in the interim, the group ownership had changed. So the English company wasn't ultimately owned by the US parent. It was owned by a group of the secondary investors. So, and that brought about some of the challenge through the waterfall series, because the economics shifted from money that would have otherwise flowed back from the UK to the US. Actually, it was replumbed to a much smaller cohort of investor, which if clearly upset other investors.
So, but this was a complex group, and it was a group insolvency, couldn't be more cross border than that. But you need to work it out box by box. And so, would you say that the result in the UK was very much, also credited to the fact that we used the UK rules to our, greatest advantage. Therefore, this box could get more assets than anywhere else. If it was a truly cross-border insolvency that was run out of one procedure, this box would not have had, the amount of, I guess, assets to distribute that it had. But it was because it was ring-fenced in the UK.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. It was a regulated UK business with a high degree of capital. It marked its book, mark to market every day. So the starting point is that company should have been solvent. Yeah. It was the impact of closeout losses, costs of the process, and the timing impact of affiliated claims that, as I say, there was no special administration regime that gave us a work plan. It was something that, a big team from PwC, Linklaters and elsewhere worked through to, find that way forward. And that's obviously been replicated in other situations.
And it was also because all the cash pooling was all done upstairs. The tap was, shut, and therefore no liquidity came in the group anymore. As you said, rich on assets, poor on cash. You have a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think within first couple of days, the administrators have got £100 million, working capital position, because there was no money. Yeah.
Interesting. So maybe I'd like to pivot to, I guess, the situation that you're in now. You've started Armada Advisors a number of years ago. You do interim roles, CRO roles, independent board positions, hands-on, helping out in situations where the company from the inside needs assistance. And I thought you described it quite nicely. It's almost like, I'm the same as I have always been, an IP coming in. But an IP without any protection. So how has that change actually been for you? And yeah, is it what you expected? Is it different from what you expected?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted, I wanted a different challenge, and I was very lucky to work for PwC for 30 years, but I wanted to make my life uncomfortable, and that meant leaving and going to the other extreme and just being sort of me on my own. And yeah, it was a big challenge, very, very different. But actually, it's done what I hoped it would. It's put me into any number of situations that I wouldn't have done before, and kept me more on my sort of toes because yeah, you have a greater responsibility and yeah, acutely aware that if you're if you're a director in a distress going into a distress situation, effectively going back to the US UK model, you are an administrator, but in all but name and none of the powers, none of the protection, but you are trying to do that marshalling job and as I say, as I talked about before, trying to keep stakeholders there and push towards a transaction, maybe a pre-pack, maybe a sale or whatever, but it's a pretty challenging place to be, but yeah, I've enjoyed it.
And do you think that now we have more tools than, I guess, 30 years ago to deal with financial distress? Is it, again, is in your view the English system that we have, well, preferable over the US system that is a lot more court driven? And maybe the most recent thing that is coming over out of the States, and we'll see to what extent it also is used in the UK and Europe, is the liability management exercises, especially if you're going to take on director roles. It's going to be interesting to see how you assess whether that is something you're comfortable with
Mm.
in the UK, even if the US is comfortable, especially in a group situation. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think as you're talking about it, it does. I mean, I should be yeah more being a debtor in possession with a sort of a court a court protecting or providing some safeguard in the background is an attractive place to be as opposed to a board trying to have the conviction what you're doing is right, but as I say, not necessarily the sort of the legal confirmation. I think we've obviously got the monitor role, but I don't think I've come across it. I've contemplated it, but it doesn't. It seems to have sort of fallen short, and certainly in a sort of special situations in environment. Um, but I think I do think that actually the UK has got the right environment to enable um, that pre-transaction work to be undertaken without higher level of court supervision. It does, frankly, I'm much more acutely aware of the risks and the challenges that directors have to carry in that process. It's from a world of, as we talked about, the support that you get in a large organization to sort of being out there on your own, obviously with a management team around you, legal advisors, financial advisors. It's a different gig for sure.
Yeah. So while you were at PwC, doing the things you were doing, and I guess getting more comfortable with the profession, learning more, was there like a mission for yourself that you had that you wanted to accomplish while you were there? Or is there not like an overarching thing that you try to achieve in the profession?
Um, I think I'm pretty fortunate in that I just, I was very privileged to be able to go to work every day to, do client work. So, I had pretty limited, if any, internal responsibilities. And so actually, I rode a wave of client activity over a long period of time. And that's fundamentally what I enjoyed. That's what I enjoyed doing. So I didn't have any goal and certainly didn't know that's what I want to do. But, I guess I'm a pretty sort of practical person in some respects. So actually, out there problem solving, working with really bright people, big teams in difficult situations with a bit of time pressure against a background to try and make something happen. I always found that really exciting. So I think I gravitated more to that than in, leadership roles within the firm or management responsibility for that. And thankfully the expectations of the firm on me to do internal stuff were pretty limited, so it worked out well.
I guess in big law firms or in law firms in general, you always have the concept of the rainmaker, right? The person who brings in the work. But obviously, the work needs to be done as well, and it's a team effort. But typically, it's the focus is on the rainmakers, right? How was that for you in PwC, and what can you say about that concept in our profession? Is that present? Have you experienced it? Or is it just like stories in certain situations, but it's not really across the board?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I never saw myself as a rainmaker, and I think I think that we've seen a shift in the way that work happens. I like the phrase that you're only as good as your last job, and I certainly think that actually, you know, a firm's focus around doing the best work, the most imaginative solutions, is ultimately what's going to pave the way to future success. Inevitably, I think the insolvency profession has had all special situations. There are big characters, and there is a sort of a lightning rod type effect to that. But you know, whilst I'm not a specialist in any area, the chances are that if you've done a failed investment bank and someone else is trying to think about how to get their head around another failed investment bank, you're probably going to want to talk to someone that's done it before. I think that the success of firms actually is around the amalgamation of different strengths and skills in order to work well as a team, and all of that.
And the the big four have always struggled in the States to get, foot on the ground, while in the UK they've always been, a force in the space. How do you explain that? And is it something that, again, if there are four big ones, how do you get positioned better than the others to get the work? Or was it always the case that actually four big ones could divvy up the market nicely? Everybody had enough to feed their teams.
I think all firms have on a journey and quest for growth as best they can. I think UK, yeah, is dominated. Well, was no longer, I think, dominated by the traditional larger firms. Now, I think that landscape's very, very, very different. Europe, I think.
And why is that, you think?
I think one, the buyer population has increased, secondary investors, so there's a much bigger community of stakeholder, which means that there are a lot more relationships out there being formed. Um,
So no longer the banks, and once you had the banks, they with the big four, and that was the market.
yeah, yeah, and also regulation. I think sort of conflict work has been an impediment at times. I mean, PwC was, you know, as a gating item, was fortunate that it didn't audit Enron and then didn't audit Lehman. Otherwise, that work would have, by definition, had to go somewhere else. So that's been an issue. And then also, I think that actually we've seen fewer, a reduced incidence of large insolvency. So actually, it's led to different solutions, and how they're delivered. So I think that's changed the UK market. Europe, I think you've seen grow. You talked about a lot of, you know, office holders are probably lawyers rather than accountants. The accountants have a big part to play in supporting them, or doing the more traditional sort of finance work for distress situations. And, I think Europe plays a bigger part in terms of being able to sort of deliver its own solutions. The States, I mean, I think ultimately UK versus the States, you had to be, it would have been really hard to be strong in either market because of to do US work, you've got to have your statement of disinterest, I think. So, that would have been tricky. But I think the gaps narrowed between, you've got some very big firms now in the UK and in the States. The big four, I'm not sure that I think that given the scale of the firms over there, growing an insolvency restructuring team, it's one of a number of opportunities that they pursued, but others other firms, boutiques have been much more successful at it.
So it's an interesting observation that in the big four, I mean, PwC is probably, is one of the last ones that still has everything under one roof, but the restructuring teams have spun out. While actually you see with law firms, they get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I guess the challenge there is very much, how do you manage a team that is across various jurisdictions and avoid that there is just a conglomerate of islands that are competing against each other, as opposed to one global group that actually uses its geographical reach to be competitive for, I guess, the interesting large cross-border matters that are there. That is sort of the challenge for anybody managing those teams in those large institutions.
Absolutely.
Just looking from the outside in.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe we could turn to the future and what it holds. What do you think is going to happen in our space? I think one thing that I believe I have observed myself is that the space has become a lot more diverse, in the sense, when I started, it was very much, white old man that were dominating, and, we're quickly getting into that category, but we're surrounded by a lot of other people that have, come into the profession. A lot of women, a lot of people with diverse backgrounds. I believe personally that is very much a force for good, and that's going to continue. But it has changed things. Is that sort of also your conclusion?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and like you, I absolutely welcome it. I think I think that no one has got a predefined right to say that they know better than anyone else. So I think it's great to look back over time and see how people have developed and flourished in their own way, in their own areas of excellence. So absolutely, what will happen in the future? I suspect more of that. I think that
Even though, we now have this sort of backlash of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it sort of swung the other way because people are compensating for too much woke. But ultimately, you believe we're going to move forward in the direction of diversity. There is no two ways about it.
I think that I think that it's a snowball in that, every rotation it's gathering more momentum, whatever the views elsewhere. I just think that you've got a fundamental groundswell of movement in that direction. The best change is enduring, and I think we will see it as enduring because actually, certainly in the world that I was in, it was recognized that there was no overnight fix to inclusion. It was something that you had to make gradual changes and keep making them, and over time they would bed in. And I think that's certainly when I look around, I think that that's what we're seeing.
And what about the strong influence of geopolitics on our profession and the world in general, and I guess retreat from globalization? Is that going to affect our space, and if so, how?
Absolutely. You know, to me, I've got full respect for secondary investors because, if an asset's notional is 100 and you're being offered at 80, you've got to think that it's got to be worth more than that. You'd be doubting yourself as to whether it's worth, less. I think a lot of the standard approach would be, in a special sits world, what's the base value? What's your sort of downside here? And I think geopolitics, creates risk around that, because you don't want to get your that analysis wrong. And I think, back to Thames Water, I think, geopolitics around, politicians and customers calling for special administration. I think that might work from a customer sort of point of view, because they're not seeing any difference and nothing would change anyway. But from all sorts of other things, I think if you've got, 15 to 20 billion pounds of debt owed to financial institutions, that would be a pretty dramatic thing to, give in against a backdrop of trying to save businesses, as we've been trying to do for a number of years. So I think geopolitics is pretty concerning, actually, because it make you want to be able to, make good predictions, and you can't do that when tariffs are up, tariffs are down. Obviously all the tragic unrest around the world, that makes it difficult. But for us to do our job, we've got to be able to understand what the downside is, and I think geopolitics makes that much harder.
Yeah, yeah. So looking, back over your career so far, what are sort of the key lessons learned for you? Having been in various positions, big ones, small ones, protected as an IP, and unprotected now as a CRO and an independent director.
I think the lessons are, work with, you've got to work with teams, because I think that gets the best result. Different experiences, different qualifications, different styles, and if you can bring that all together, you've got a good chance of succeeding. I think that you've got to be pretty reflective around who you are and how you're developing. And as I say, I can say I've failed a number of times, and actually that's something you've got to come to terms with, and you've got to be able to learn from that.
So can you give like an example of, where it didn't go the way you wanted to go, how it affected you, and how you then actually took the lessons from that and used it to your benefit to then, further develop,
Yeah, yeah. I think in I guess I was several years into sort of post qualification, so sort of into my career, specializing. And it's actually, you think you know an awful lot, and then actually you find yourself in a transaction, and you recognize that you don't know as much as you should know, and you certainly you need to know a whole lot more than you do. That meant that actually we were pretty challenged as a group as to how we were going to get through that. So it was being aware of that, ideally sooner rather than later, and actually being able to respond to that. And then, that was pretty major. That took a long time to recover that situation. Other times it's going into a meeting, not being as quite as prepared as you should be, and it actually not carrying the meeting as you thought you would, not getting your point of view across, and not taking your stakeholders to where you felt they should get to. So, and that can be difficult as well. So
And did you get that feedback, yourself because you picked it up, or were others helpful, or less helpful in pointing it out to you?
oh my god, I mean, it would, I wouldn't say it happened once or twice. It would happen, you know. I wouldn't paint the picture that more often than not, but when it did happen, some of the time, as I say, if you're watching and listening, you should get there yourself. But inevitably, there'd be a way to for somehow that feedback to come back to you.
But it is important that, especially for younger people, I think, to hear that, yeah, if something doesn't go according to plan, that doesn't mean that you need to stop. You need to continue to do it. And it's just, you build and build and build experience, momentum, and what have you. And yeah, everybody falls down. It's
Yeah.
how you get up. And it's more than what, because yeah, everybody these days is obviously focused on the successes, and
Yeah.
those are on social media all the time, and it looks like everybody's always every day successful. Compared to you have nothing to report, or maybe once in a blue moon you have something to report. But how come that everybody is so much more successful than I am? That seems to be, at least talking to my kids, sometimes the conversation is like, well, but maybe that's not full reality, right? They're not giving you all the facts.
But I think God, I'm 57. I'm able to make those disclosures that, yeah, some things at certain times haven't gone well, and I'm not surprised. My academic record is pretty fundamentally poor. Um, but for those coming through now, it's got to be much, much harder to make those disclosures around things when they haven't gone well. And inevitably, in a process world, it's easier to pick up on shortcomings than congratulate again on amongst a high achieving peer group. So I think it's tricky. I'm pretty relaxed and open about it, but I think you know I wouldn't. It doesn't necessarily need to be overshared, but I think for an individual, actually understanding, building your own awareness where things haven't gone well, and trying to work out, with help or not, a plan to come through that, I think is good, and actually it's pretty critical in a world of sort of mental health concerns and all of that you can.
So, what kind of person are you then? Do you respond well to encouragement, or do you respond well to discouragement? People thinking Russell can't do that. Well, if they say that Russell can't do it, he will definitely going to prove them wrong.
I,
Or is it actually better that somebody actually supports you in doing something right, and that will fuel you to do more of that?
I respond to the center failure, whether I'm being encouraged or discouraged. It's you know it's committing to try and get something done, and we are custodians of a situation, and we have a job to deliver. It's personal accountability, but actually, it's working with that team to, make sure that you can all support one another to get what needed done. But actually, if there's inevitably there will be, you can't think it's going to succeed every day. You have to be testing it with what can go wrong and try and work through that, and that will help you get there.
And do you think that in the UK now we have an environment where that's possible, or do you think, well, from what you know, that for example the US environment is better in that way? Again, I'm sort of reflecting on, I guess, recent conversations with one of my sons who actually went to the States to study and is, pursuing his sort of venture over there. The environment for people that want to do something entrepreneurial, something off the beaten track. It's always been my experience that the US is a lot more encouraging and supportive for that. And if it doesn't work out, there's no like Schadenfreude. Look, I told you so, doing some. No, they're like, well, okay, man,
Mm,
really good, having a go at it, and
mm,
let's try again. But in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Europe, I feel that it is still very difficult. How do we change that?
mm. I think we're pretty entrepreneurial here, and I think actually, the millennials coming through, and those behind them, I think that they've got higher ambition not necessarily to succeed, but be clearer about the whole basket of issues, how they work, where they live, and all that sort of stuff. And I think that that's increasingly an environment where that package can be addressed. So the individual component around development of business ideas, I think that's always going to be tough. So as many more will fail than succeed. But I think as a way of working, I think there is more flexibility. But I think, the worlds are going to change quite dramatically. We're into this for some time. I haven't talked about AI yet.
No, well, yeah, that was another one. Is that going to help or hinder us? I think the more I'm thinking about it myself is that I believe that if our generation is able to somehow embrace that and have an AI assistant alongside us, we could do an awful lot. The problem is, are we able to actually, do that, adapt quickly enough to make this part of, the other experience that we already have? We can be a lot more effective if we could do it. On the other hand, the ones who probably are most likely positioned to do this very well are very inexperienced yet. So there is something to sort of, bridge here. So maybe it is you need to have a young person who is very well versed in using the AIs alongside, somebody like ourselves, so that you can have a lot more output with less capabilities required. And maybe that is what you need to do, because a lot of the larger situations, as we know, there's so much information. So an AI can definitely work there. But as you said, one of the key aspects of our job is provide the understanding, provide the trust, provide the confidence, make judgment calls. That's the kind of stuff that I can't see AI going to do, because, it's not a human and we're dealing with humans. So it's sort of the human aspect that we should highlight with the use of AI as a tool that enhances our capabilities that we already have.
No, I agree with that. I think, I would say that, wouldn't I? But I don't think AI can replicate, a lifetime of experience, so that in the moment it can make the right decision, that
It or, the person,
yeah,
the human who actually uses it.
the person behind it. So
Yeah, exactly. Because ultimately, to me, you can't forget that ultimately the AI is very smart in certain ways.
yeah,
But again, that softer stuff that makes us all human is actually pretty important, especially in our profession.
well, you might get an AI judge. Put your papers into court and plan gets sanctioned because
Yeah, I don't know if I'm sort of ready for that, to be really honest. Really, really. I mean, again, being a judge, I don't know. It's a whole different ball game. And it's a different ball game from, I guess, what we've been discussing. Although, as you said, in the States, probably the judge is very much a player and a leading player in a lot of situations. I think in the UK, it's obviously an important part of the process, but I think there's a little bit of an aversion from judges to sort of, yeah, take control of things. They facilitate things. They make, rulings on being briefed properly about what it is. But that's a different role than the States.
yeah, no,
Yeah. Wow. Look, I think we've covered quite a bit, and there's obviously a lot more that we can cover. Maybe two things that I want to close with. One is sort of outside of the work, which obviously is a big part and has always been a big part of your life. What's the other parts, of your life that you're sort of excited about, and have you been able to marry those up nicely with your profession?
So my business is called Armada, a fleet of ships. So I like my
Gold in there, right? Or pursuing some gold.
I like things on the water. So that thing there is my water ski. And when I talk about failure, I should tell you the last time I went water skiing a couple of weeks ago was one of the biggest fails of my water skiing career. So I surf anything on the water on it rather than diving or anything like that. So The other week I went as fast as I've ever been on a windsurfer, which was scarily fast.
But you came out
Yeah,
without
well,
major injuries.
I think there's still a hole in the water where I fell in, but
So are you replicating the buzz you get from like a Lehman, that adrenaline, you need to find it somewhere.
you've got to be taken out of your comfort zone into a world of clinging on.
And do you think actually, because there's a number of people I know in the profession that all are, attracted to the water, are sort of sailors. Is there something in, somebody that has a sailor's mindset that works well for restructuring and special shits as well? Or is it just, well, it's just luck?
I think I don't think so. I just think it's sort of I'm fortunate that I've sort of grown up doing that and been able to carry it on. So
It is just, yeah, from an early age and sort of being on the water.
than
Yeah,
jumping
look,
out of planes.
I've never really, in the Netherlands, a lot of people are on the water, but yeah, it's sort of, it's never caught me. So then maybe the last thing to close is, what's your advice for young people that look at the list of jobs that you could do, and maybe now, this is mature enough as a job in its own, special sits? What would you advise them, on pursuing a career in the space that we've been operating in for a while, and hopefully will continue to operate for a while?
I'd say throw yourself into it. I think it's an interesting perspective that puts you to the heart of a business. You're not in any one particular area. You're in the boardroom as a proxy for what is going to happen to that business. And I think that's a privileged, view to have. And so I think it's fascinating. So anyone thinking, can dealing with companies in trouble or that make a difference? I think it's well worth having a go to find out. And I think actually, don't be put off that you need tons of qualifications to, make a difference. I think what's helped me ultimately is those skills around, working with people and being not afraid to make a decision, certainly not afraid when things don't go well all the time, but persevering. And yeah, I think give it a go for sure.
And is PwC or the likes of PwC the entrance point, or a large law firm, or are there many other entrance points that people should consider?
I I I think traditionally, absolutely, but I think that to me, the key attribute is leadership. So it's whatever skills and experiences you take, from whenever through to be able to say I'm a leader because I've done this. I think that's what will set you up to come into a world of challenges with special situations and all of that.
Great. Hey, Russell, really appreciate your time, your
Oh no, I've
insights,
enjoyed it.
sharing some interesting sort of thoughts about the career so far.
Mhm.
I hope that everybody listening to this point in the conversation has enjoyed it as well. And stay tuned for the next conversation. And bye bye.
Thank you very much.